Sequences are melodic ideas that are repeated immediately at a transposition. So in your book it says the sequence is an immediate restatement of a melodic motive or longer figure in the same instrumental vocal part at a higher or lower pitch. Yes, but what I said is just fine too. It's some idea that you immediately repeat, but instead of having it at the same note starting, you transpose it up or down. And that amount that you transpose it is called the interval of transposition. So you have to have the original idea, and then each of the additional repetitions is called an additional segment. So let's look at some examples of that. Here we have this thing called a real sequence, or an exact copy of something that's transposed up or down. The original here is called segment 1. The copied version that's copied and transposed is the next segment, or segment 2, right? So sequences have to have at least 2 segments. They have to have the original and at least one of these copies. Segment 1 followed by segment 2. So it sounds the same because the same succession of intervals happens. Starts out with D's, goes down by half step, then major third. Starts out with E's over here, so everything's moved up. Goes down by half step and then major third. So it's the same idea, except for starting on D's here, it was transposed when it was repeated. Transposed up a second. Real sequences have the exact same amount of half steps in them. So they're an exact transposition. But notice what happens here. It's got this accidental here. Oftentimes, if you're making a real sequence, it ends up starting to use notes that are not part of the key signature in order to make things work exactly. Because of that, they can call this a modulating sequence as well. So let's quickly review. Sequences are melodic patterns that are immediately repeated but at a transposition. They contain at least 2 segments. They have the same succession of interval sizes, so the same intervals happen one after another. They could be just the same size, or they could be the exact same half-step quality. Oftentimes they move in the same direction, and they move by the same interval of transposition. So what we just looked at was called a real sequence, but there's both tonal and real. Tonal sequences, they have the same succession of interval sizes, but it's not exact necessarily. They might not have the exact same half-step relationship, or they might not have the same succession of interval qualities. They use notes that are found in the key. The ones that we just looked at, real, they have the same succession of exact qualities, exact same amount of half steps in each interval. Okay, and because of that, as I said, it usually moves them to new keys, so they sometimes call them modulating sequences. Let's take a look now at these tonal sequences, the ones that have the same interval sizes, like thirds or fourths, but they don't have necessarily the exact same qualities because they're trying to stay within the key. So here we have a tonal sequence, and a tonal sequence here, again, has the same succession of interval sizes. In this case, in the Sibelius example, it's moving down by seconds, E to D sharp. Notice though, half step. When it's transposed and repeated, it moves up by a third from E to G sharp here. Now when it moves from this G sharp to F sharp. So it's moving down a major second. It didn't do that originally. Remember, it moved down from an E to a D sharp or a minor second. Because of that, because of it having seconds, but the seconds not being exact, right? Minor second, major seconds. Because it's the same size but not the exact same quality, they call it a tonal sequence. And notice there's no extra accidentals. It stays within the key. Same thing could happen with the Tchaikovsky. Next statement. In this example, it moved up by a whole step here. And in the segment 2, it moves up by a half step. There's also some other differences too, right? At the end, moves down by a minor third here. Over here, by a major third from B to G. So tonal sequence, same size, but not the exact same quality. What's a modified sequence? Well, books vary on how they talk about this. But ultimately, something's different about the sequence, and you can still tell that it's supposed to be a sequence. Ben Ward talks about this so far as melodic embellishment. So here we have B, C sharp to D. In the next segment, if we just use the first note of each triplet, it'll sound really similar to the first segment. So here's first note, A sharp. Next note, B. Next, C sharp. Now I'm going to play it like that with only the first note of the triplets. So segment 1, segment 2. All right. So in segment 2, they've changed the timing. We have these triplet figures used. And they've also added these extra notes after the original note that embellish it. It's kind of like a neighbor tone, lower neighbor tone figure. Down, back up. Note, down, back up. So, whole thing. What your book calls a false sequence isn't necessarily shared by other authors. Oftentimes people just lump all the variations of sequences into what's called a modified sequence. But we will go about it the way the book says and acknowledge this kind of subcategory of modified sequences. So a false sequence is something then that in some way doesn't have the same interval size succession, right? Not all the intervals are the same size like you would have in a tonal sequence. So what that means is sometimes you just, instead of transposing things, you only repeat it. In this case, we have B flat going to E. But then it starts out again in B flat, when this B flat should have really moved up a step to a C. So ends up repeating and then having a fourth here as opposed to this fifth. Another example is a Schubert symphony. Starts out and plays a B flat major chord. What it should do then is transpose it down half step and have A, C, E flat. It doesn't though, it has A, C, F. Because of that, right, these Fs are repeated, but they're not transposed, right, just repeated verbatim. So it makes it a false sequence because it doesn't have the exact same interval sizes, but something varies in its size. Let's go back and do a review. These real sequences have the same exact interval qualities. The tonal ones have the same interval sizes. There's some variance though. Modified sequences could have embellishments. Typically they have the same intervallic structure, but this is dependent on the theorist, the music theorist that talks about this. Okay. In this case, they'll be ornamented in various ways. Maybe the time has changed, but it sounds like the original one still. What this book calls a false sequence oftentimes is lumped in with modified sequences in other books. But how do we differentiate them? Well, we say if one or more of the interval sizes is different from the original. And note sizes. It could be different in the quality, that's fine. But if it's different in size, it's neither a real sequence or tonal sequence. It's just this changed or modified thing. And because the idea of a sequence is usually having the same succession of interval sizes, at least, if it doesn't, then they'll say here it's a false sequence.